They always remembered her on evenings meant for forgetting. In the warm glow of chandeliers and the murmured confidence of silk and wealth, she moved quietly between shadows, carrying silver trays and unspoken histories, her presence acknowledged only when service was required. That night, the house brimmed with voices polished by privilege, and the young woman in the dark dress felt the familiar tightening at her ribs, the knowledge that she belonged to the room and yet did not. Her name was spoken rarely, and when it was, it came softened by command. She had been born to gentler syllables once. There were years when her father's study smelled of leather and ink, when she learned her letters beside the fire, and her hands knew books before brooms. But fortunes falter as easily as candles in a draught, and dignity, once cracked, must be carried with care. Now she wore a plain apron over a serviceable gown, its fabric honest and dark, its purpose to be overlooked. The gathering had been arranged in her father's honor, though it bore little resemblance to honor now. Guests arrived with polished shoes and sharper eyes, glancing at the furniture with appraisal rather than welcome. Laughter drifted like perfume, sweet and stinging. She poured wine and refilled glasses, her posture composed, her gaze lowered. A lady with pearls at her throat smiled thinly and asked, without malice yet with perfect accuracy, whether the maid might fetch warmer candles. Another voice replied that servants were best when unseen. The words fell gently. They still bruised. It was then that he arrived. There was no flourish to announce him, no raised voice or deliberate pause. He entered as men accustomed to doors opening do, without doubt. The room adjusted around him, chairs angling, attention bending like wheat in wind. He wore black with the quiet authority of one who did not require color to be noticed, his coat cut with restraint, his gloves immaculate. He greeted her father with ease as an equal might, and for a moment she felt the old ache of memory, how once such men had spoken to her as though she too belonged. She was sent to serve him tea. Approaching, she became acutely aware of herself, the careful knot of her hair, the faint warmth in her cheeks, the steadiness she practiced like a discipline. She placed the cup before him with practiced grace. "Sir," she said, her voice low, trained to offend no one. He thanked her, and his tone held something unfamiliar, attention. When she lifted her eyes despite herself, she found his already upon her. It was not the bold gaze of appraisal she knew too well, nor the casual dismissal that passed for courtesy. It was a stillness, intent and unguarded. His eyes did not skim her apron or pause upon her hands. They met her face as though it mattered. The moment stretched, thin and dangerous. Somewhere behind her, laughter rose again. She withdrew, pulse unsteady, telling herself that noticing was not the same as seeing. Throughout the evening, she felt the weight of that glance linger like heat after a fire. When she crossed the room, she sensed him following her progress not with ownership, but curiosity. Once, as she passed behind his chair, he asked her name. She answered. He repeated it, carefully as though committing it to memory. A gentleman nearby arched a brow, amused. The lady with pearls watched them both. She reminded herself of the rules she had learned too young. Do not linger. Do not imagine. Kindness, when offered downward, often comes at a cost. She focused on her duties, on the comfort of ritual, on the quiet pride of doing her work well. Yet something had shifted. The room no longer felt entirely closed to her. A crack had opened, narrow as a breath. As the night drew on, conversation grew louder, looser. Wine encouraged confidences. She heard her own story retold in fragments by others. Her father's misfortune, her reduced circumstances, presented as gentle gossip, palatable because it was not their own. A guest laughed softly and remarked that the household was fortunate to possess such a well-mannered maid, almost a lady one might think if one did not know better. The words were meant lightly. They landed with precision. She carried an empty tray into the corridor where the light dimmed and the air cooled. There, for the first time that evening, she allowed herself to breathe. Her reflection in the mirror startled her. Eyes bright with something like defiance, mouth set with resolve. She straightened her shoulders. Whatever this man's attention meant, it would not unmake her. She thought of her mother then, long gone, who had once warned her that silence could be mistaken for consent, and that a woman must guard her heart as fiercely as her reputation. The memory steadied her. Around them the house breathed and listened. Footsteps echoed like judgment. A servant paused at the threshold, curious. The world, she knew, would allow 1,000 small cruelties to pass unremarked, yet would never forgive a single boldness. She gathered herself, feeling the fragile line between obedience and selfhood tighten, aware that even a conversation might become a scandal before morning. It was a perilous hour, weighted with consequence and restraint. When she returned, the guest in black was standing alone as though waiting. He looked at her, and this time there was no mistaking it. His expression held recognition and regret, and the beginning of a question he did not yet know how to ask. She inclined her head, ready to pass him by, but his voice stopped her, gentle, precise, and filled with promise. "Miss," he said, as though the title were no accident. "May I speak with you?" In that instant, beneath the watching chandeliers and the whispering walls, she understood that whatever followed would change the careful shape of her life, and she did not yet know whether to hope or to flee. In the days that followed, the house seemed to remember him even when he was absent. His voice lingered in corridors, measured and courteous, and his presence clung to objects he had touched, as though the air itself had learned his shape. She moved through her duties with careful composure, yet found her attention repeatedly drawn to the door, half expecting it to open at his unannounced return. When it did not, disappointment arrived before she could stop it, swift and humiliating. He did return, of course. Men like him always did, though rarely for reasons so dangerously personal. Each visit was marked by a restraint that felt deliberate, almost protective. He spoke to her father at length, discussing matters of land and legacy she pretended not to hear, while she served quietly at the edges. Yet when she passed, he acknowledged her with the smallest inclination of his head, a courtesy reserved for equals. It unsettled her more than open admiration ever could. It began with a book. She found it one morning upon the sideboard in the small sitting room, placed with care atop a folded cloth. Its leather cover was worn, familiar. She recognized it instantly, having once spoken of it aloud during a moment of foolish ease. A volume of poetry she had loved as a girl, before necessity stripped her library bare. There was no note, no explanation. Her hands trembled as she opened it, finding no inscription, only the quiet certainty that it had been meant for her. The gift unsettled the household. Servants whispered of favoritism, of boldness improperly encouraged. A footman remarked that such generosity toward a maid was either careless or calculated. She heard it all and said nothing, her silence thick with unease. Gratitude warred with fear. She returned the book to its place each evening, unsure whether accepting it marked her as presumptuous, or refusing it ungrateful. The second token came days later, wrapped in quiet necessity. A chill had settled over London, the sort that crept into bones and refused to leave. As she stood in the entryway one afternoon, overseeing a delivery, she felt a sudden warmth settle around her shoulders. A shawl, fine but unassuming, had been draped there without ceremony. She turned, startled, to find him already retreating, his back straight, his pace unhurried. He did not look back. The gesture, discreet and undeniable, left her breathless. With each kindness, the house leaned closer, listening. Eyes followed her movements more keenly. A lady caller lingered too long in the hall, her gaze sharp with curiosity. Another guest laughed softly and remarked that the maid had grown above her station, that indulgence had a way of encouraging illusion. The words reached her like smoke, unseen yet suffocating. She felt the invisible lines of society tighten, reminding her how easily admiration could curdle into accusation. She told herself that he was merely kind, that his attentions were those of a gentleman with leisure and sympathy. She told herself that men like him did not cross thresholds meant to remain closed. Yet when he spoke to her, asking after her well-being with genuine concern, the careful defenses she had built faltered. His questions were never intrusive, never familiar. They hovered at the edge of intimacy, respectful yet persistent, as though inviting her to step closer of her own accord. Once, as she cleared away teacups, he asked whether she ever missed the life she might have led. The question struck her with painful accuracy. She answered honestly, though quietly, admitting that she missed nothing so much as being unafraid. His expression changed then, a shadow passing over features otherwise composed. He did not apologize. Instead, he said, "Fear should never be the cost of dignity." The words followed her long after he left the room. Scandal, when it came, arrived not with thunder but with laughter. She overheard it by accident, standing just beyond the drawing-room door. A guest spoke of the mysterious gentleman's fascination with the household maid, delighting in the novelty of it. Another suggested that the girl had set her cap too high, that ambition disguised as modesty was the most dangerous sort. The room hummed with agreement. She slipped away unnoticed, heart pounding, cheeks burning with a shame she had not earned. That evening she considered leaving. The thought came quietly, fully formed, carrying with it a weary sense of relief. She could not bear to become a spectacle, a whispered amusement. She packed nothing, told no one, but lingered at the window long after dusk fell, watching the street below. Carriages passed, their lanterns glowing like distant stars. Somewhere among them, she imagined him, unaware of the chaos his kindness had stirred. The next morning brought a letter. It was addressed to her father, sealed with care, and delivered by a servant unfamiliar to the household. She did not read it, yet she sensed its weight before it was opened. Her father's expression shifted as he scanned the page, surprise yielding to something like astonishment. He looked at her, then really looked as though seeing her anew. "There is to be a ball," he said slowly. "An invitation has been extended. For both of us." She understood at once that the world was about to demand a choice of her. The tokens, the whispers, the growing attention had been leading here, toward a threshold she had never intended to cross. As she stood in the quiet room, book on the table and shawl still folded at her side, she realized that whatever waited beyond that invitation would either claim her dignity or strip it bare. And somewhere, in a grand house lit by 1,000 candles, the man in black was waiting to see whether she would come. She pressed her palm to the glass, feeling the cold, and wondered whether courage would arrive with silk and music, or whether it would abandon her entirely when the doors opened and leave her breathless inside. The evening of the ball arrived with a hush that settled over the city like falling snow. Gas lamps glimmered along cobblestone streets, their light reflected in puddles left by a fleeting drizzle. Inside the manor, the air was thick with perfume and the rustle of silk, a symphony of anticipation and concealed intent. She stood in her room, far removed from the grand hall, clutching the folds of her gown, heart hammering against ribs that had long learned restraint. She was no longer the quiet observer of shadows. Tonight, she would walk among the very people who had once regarded her as invisible. Her dress was simple in design yet exquisite in execution, a pale cream that caught the candlelight and softened the outline of her frame. Her hair, arranged in a Victorian updo, allowed a few loose tendrils to escape and frame her face, lending her an air of delicacy that belied her resolve. A servant brought her gloves and a fan, and she took them mechanically, rehearsing calm in the mirror even as her pulse threatened to betray her composure. She wondered if the Duke would recognize her, or if the anonymity of her transformation might protect her. The ballroom opened like a gilded theater, every surface polished, every chandelier glittering with 1,000 prisms of light. Gentlemen in black coats and polished boots murmured in greetings, their expressions cultivated, their eyes calculating. Ladies in flowing gowns glided past in measured steps, skirts whispering against marble floors, jeweled hairpins catching the glow of candles. She stepped in carefully, the music swelling, her every breath measured against fear and curiosity. It was then she saw him. The Duke, unmistakable even amid a crowd of strangers, stood near the orchestra, his profile a perfect study of controlled composure. His eyes, dark and assessing, found hers immediately, and she felt the same undeniable pull she had experienced days before. He did not approach, merely observed, as though daring her to acknowledge him first. Every instinct screamed caution, every heartbeat whispered longing. She lowered her gaze momentarily, only to find him still watching, the faintest curl of a smile suggesting recognition and something unspoken beyond civility. A gentleman near him, unaware of the tension in the space between them, spoke in admiration of the Duchess attending another house, and the Duke's attention, however brief, returned instantly to her. She felt her cheeks warm, her hands clenching the folds of her gown beneath the fan. The music shifted to a slower measure, and she allowed herself to drift along the edges of the dance floor, careful not to draw attention, careful not to stumble under the weight of the gazes that might have pierced her if they noticed. Then came the moment they were alone. A side terrace, partially concealed by heavy velvet curtains, provided sanctuary from the swirl of society's watchful eyes. The door opened silently and he stepped through as if drawn by a magnet invisible to all else. His gaze swept over her, slower now, more deliberate, as though committing every detail to memory, the curve of her cheek, the tremor in her fingers, the hesitant lift of her chin. He spoke softly, the kind of tone reserved for confessions rather than conversation. "You have grown into yourself," he said, and she understood the weight of the observation. Not the maid who served tea, not the girl who fled whispers, but the woman standing before him, fragile yet undeniable. She held herself rigid, yet a tremor betrayed her as she replied, "I am afraid my courage does not match the occasion, sir." Her words were careful, formal, yet every syllable carried the tremor of unspoken truth. He took a step closer, maintaining propriety, yet closing a distance that had been measured in stolen glances for too long. "Courage," he murmured, "is seldom found where it is expected. It grows quietly, sometimes unnoticed, until the world demands its presence." His eyes softened, offering acknowledgement rather than command. She wanted to speak further, to confess that every step she had taken toward this evening had been an act of defiance against the fear she had carried for years, yet the words lodged in her throat. She could not fully trust the safety of his attention. Society had long trained her to anticipate betrayal behind every bow, every polite smile. She measured her replies carefully, letting silence speak where words might betray her. He understood, as though he had learned the language of restraint by observing the delicate architecture of her expressions. At last she dared a question of her own, almost whispered, "And yet, do you see me as I am or as you wish me to be?" A shadow of a smile touched his lips. "I see you as you allow yourself to be seen. That and nothing more would satisfy me." His words were both an offering and a challenge, a delicate balance of truth and longing. Her chest swelled with conflicting emotion, relief, hope, and the bitter recognition of how long she had been invisible. A carriage bell tolled faintly in the distance, a reminder that time within this fragile bubble was finite. She knew the world outside would not bend for them. Every moment spent here was a borrowed reprieve from the eyes that judged too harshly. She felt the pull of his presence, magnetic yet tempered by propriety, and dared to imagine what might follow if the world permitted courage to overcome caution. He extended a gloved hand not to claim but to invite. "Walk with me if only for a brief step beyond the crowd," he said. She hesitated, measuring dignity against desire, before placing her hand lightly in his. The touch was electric, a whisper of connection that the hall's grandeur could not contain. Together, they stepped into the half-shadowed corridor, the music and chatter fading into muted murmurs behind the heavy curtains. For a few moments she allowed herself the unspoken luxury of wonder. To be acknowledged fully, to be regarded with genuine regard rather than dismissal, was a perilous and intoxicating thing. She dared not meet his gaze for too long, lest she betray the years of caution that had shaped her very being. Yet his presence was a steadying force, a promise that restraint could be shared, that dignity need not be surrendered to longing. When the moment ended, she withdrew with gentle formality, stepping back into the crowd as though nothing had transpired. His eyes lingered on her, and she felt the weight of his attention follow her like a shadow. The music shifted once more, and with it, the realization that the night had changed irrevocably. Nothing in the manor could return to the simplicity of before. As she navigated back toward her place along the periphery, she felt it, a sudden, trembling certainty that the quiet, careful life she had maintained was no longer sufficient. The tokens of attention, the measured words, the brief communion upon the terrace, they had opened a door to something far larger than either had anticipated. Her pulse quickened, her breath shallow as the realization sank in. He knew her, perhaps more fully than anyone had ever dared. And in that moment, as the orchestra swelled and candles flickered against gilded mirrors, she understood the peril as well as the promise. The evening was not merely a gathering of wealth and decorum. It was a crucible in which courage would be measured against fear, desire weighed against duty, and hearts tested in ways that polite society could never predict. She glanced toward the Duke, his silhouette resolute and watchful, and felt a tremor of hope. And dread coiled tight in her chest. She had stepped into the ballroom to conceal herself, yet found herself utterly exposed. And somewhere in the shadows, a secret lay waiting to be revealed. Days passed in a haze of expectation, each hour stretched thin by the knowledge that the Duke's presence, though absent, lingered in every shadowed corner of her father's house. The morning light fell through tall windows, painting gold across the polished floors, yet even the warmth of the sun failed to reach the chill she felt within. She moved with deliberate care, attending to duties she had long performed as though on autopilot, yet every tray she carried, every footstep along the corridor, seemed measured against an invisible gauge of scrutiny. The gifts and secret glances, tokens left without ceremony, had begun to speak louder than words, creating a tension both exhilarating and unbearable. She had tried to return the shawl, to place the book back in the library where it might remain unnoticed, yet neither attempt had felt adequate. Each act of refusal seemed to invite attention rather than escape it. She realized then that her life had entered a delicate balance, suspended between the ordinary rhythm of service and a world of quiet passion that dared not speak its name. Every glance from him carried meaning, every measured smile a confession withheld. She could not tell if it was pity, admiration, or something deeper. Society had trained her to doubt the sincerity behind kindness, yet her heart whispered otherwise. It was during the afternoon that a letter arrived, slipped beneath the door of her father's study, sealed with wax and bearing a flourish that spoke of wealth and authority. Her father's hand trembled slightly as he broke the seal, scanning the contents with a mixture of astonishment and caution. She lingered nearby, trying to appear indifferent, though her pulse quickened with the certainty that the message contained some verdict upon her precarious position. The words, when finally read aloud by her father, were both simple and extraordinary: an invitation to a private meeting, a request for her presence at the manor, under the guise of a discussion about household affairs. Yet she sensed the subtext, the unspoken promise that this meeting would traverse boundaries normally held inviolate. The evening arrived with a tempestuous sky, clouds rolling low and threatening rain. She descended the staircase, the hem of her gown whispering against polished wood, a shiver of anticipation running along her spine. The Duke waited in the drawing room, away from the prying eyes of guests, framed by the glow of a hearth whose flames flickered as though in sympathy with the tension in the air. He rose as she entered, the expression upon his face unreadable, controlled, yet edged with something unrestrained that made her breath catch. For the first time, the full measure of his authority became palpable, not in the grandeur of his coat or the exactness of his gloves, but in the gravity he carried simply by being present. He did not speak immediately, allowing the silence to stretch, a careful weight pressing upon both of them. She felt exposed, yet unshielded in the way one feels when the truth is about to be revealed. His eyes, dark and deliberate, traced the line of her jaw, the tilt of her shoulders, the very rhythm of her breathing. Finally, he broke the silence with a question that seemed to bypass pretense entirely. "Do you understand the consequences of your presence here tonight?" His voice was quiet but firm, measured as if he were both offering protection and issuing a challenge. She met his gaze steadily, though her hands betrayed a slight tremor. "I do," she said, her voice soft, carrying both resolve and trepidation. "I have learned to bear what must be borne." The words were not intended to provoke sympathy, yet they did, and he inclined his head, acknowledgment shining in the depths of his gaze. There was a pause, pregnant and deliberate, before he stepped closer, bridging the distance with careful restraint. "You have lived under observation, under the weight of expectation and whispered judgment," he said. "I would have you know that none of it diminishes your worth in my eyes." His words, though courteous, carried an intensity that made her heart falter. They were not the idle courtesies of society, but a declaration veiled in civility. She felt both the thrill and the peril of it, recognizing that to respond in kind could unravel the careful armor she had spent years constructing. He extended his hand, not in command, but as an offering of partnership, a tentative gesture that invited trust without demanding surrender. She hesitated, aware of the world outside that would not forgive audacity so easily. Yet the gravity in his eyes, the subtle tremor in his voice, communicated a truth that could not be ignored. He had chosen to see her, entirely and without pretense. Slowly she placed her hand in his, the contact electric yet measured, a bridge between their guarded hearts. They moved together through the corridors, voices lowered to whispers that the walls themselves seemed to absorb. He spoke of hopes unspoken, of a world in which her dignity would be preserved rather than compromised, and she allowed herself to imagine what it would be to live in a space where regard was genuine, and affection unobscured by rank or expectation. The words were careful, formal, yet charged with intimacy, each syllable a step closer to revelation. The world outside the manor remained indifferent, yet within the drawing room, a storm of emotion gathered. Candles flickered as though in anticipation, their light painting shadows that danced across the polished floors and high ceilings. She felt a stirring she had not permitted herself to feel in years, a reckless, fragile hope that perhaps courage and desire might coexist without shattering her carefully maintained sense of self. Then came the confession, quiet, deliberate, and unavoidable. "I see you," he said, voice low and steady. "I have seen you all along, and nothing, neither rank, nor rumor, nor circumstance, has altered the truth of what I feel." Her breath caught. The world tilted subtly, the heart's glow warming her cheeks and revealing the depth of longing she had long concealed. She knew, with a clarity that both terrified and emboldened her, that the balance of power in her life had shifted irrevocably. She did not speak at once. Instead, she allowed the silence to stretch, absorbing the weight of his words and measuring the consequences of acknowledgement. To admit that she reciprocated even a fraction of his feeling would place her entirely within the orbit of scrutiny she had labored to avoid. Yet to retreat, to deny the truth stirring within her, felt equally perilous, as though denying the sun itself might avert its warmth. At last she lifted her gaze, meeting his fully. "And if I were to admit that I have noticed you as well?" she asked, her voice steady despite the tumult in her chest. His eyes softened, dark pools of understanding and restrained desire. Then, he said, we would face the world together, cautiously but unflinchingly. A distant clock tolled, marking the passage of time in a house that had forgotten to move for centuries. She felt the weight of inevitability pressing upon them both, the knowledge that once revealed, this connection could not be easily contained. Yet in that instant, the possibility of love, of mutual recognition, of a future shaped by choice rather than circumstance, seemed tangible, shimmering like sunlight through rain. They parted moments later, not with the finality of dismissal, but with the charged uncertainty of promises left unspoken. She returned to her chamber, heart racing, aware that the world outside remained unyielding and indifferent. Yet within her chest, a quiet conviction took root. The Duke had chosen to see her, fully and deliberately, and in that recognition lay both peril and hope. As she sat by the window, watching the rain streak the panes in delicate rivulets, she knew the next steps would demand courage beyond anything she had previously summoned. The tokens, the glances, the whispered words, they had all led to this precipice, and the world beyond the manor's walls waited to test the fragile bridge of understanding they had begun to construct. Somewhere in the hush of the storm, she sensed the shadow of scandal and society's judgment, yet beneath it all, a single, unassailable truth. He had chosen her, and the choice could not be unmade. And in the distance, a carriage arrived at the front gates, wheels turning against cobblestones like the steady ticking of fate, heralding an arrival that would challenge every assumption, every restraint, and the carriage rolled to a halt outside the manor, its polished wheels clicking against the cobblestones in a rhythm that echoed like a heartbeat through the quiet evening. Rain had begun to fall steadily, each drop catching the glow of the gas lamps and scattering light across the darkened street. She stood at the top of the stairs, the folds of her gown clutched nervously in her hands, watching the lamps reflect in the wet stones, and wondering if courage could truly meet the weight of expectation. Every instinct told her to retreat, to slip away and leave the evening to unfold without her, yet the pull she felt toward the unknown, toward him, would not be denied. He emerged from the carriage, tall and composed even in the drizzle, his coat brushing lightly against his boots, gloves glinting with wet sheen. The Duke's eyes found hers immediately, dark and unwavering, and for the first time, there was no pretense of observation or measured reserve. He moved toward her with deliberate grace, the rain tracing rivulets along the edges of his coat, yet failing to touch the certainty that radiated from him. She felt her breath catch, the familiar mixture of fear and longing sharpening into something raw and undeniable. He stopped before her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his presence despite the chill in the air. "You came," he said, his voice low, almost a growl tempered by restraint. Each word seemed chosen with precision, heavy with meaning. "Despite everything the world would have you fear." She nodded, unable to speak immediately, the sensation of being truly seen pressing against every layer of caution she had worn like armor for so long. "Why?" she asked at last, voice trembling, carrying both defiance and vulnerability. "Why stand here in the rain when society would have us remain apart?" The question lingered between them, soaked in the tension of unspoken truths. He regarded her with a gravity that stilled the world around them. "Because," he said, stepping closer, "some truths demand courage beyond propriety. Some hearts will not wait for permission." Her hand lifted slightly, brushing against the damp fabric of his coat as though to test the reality of his presence. The touch was fleeting yet charged, a spark igniting across the span of inches that separated them. She thought of the weeks of stolen glances, of tokens placed with careful intent, of moments suspended between hope and dread. Every hesitation, every whispered glance, had led them to this precipice, and she understood that the next step would define everything she had guarded for years. He produced a small, folded note from within his coat, a final token but unlike any before. "I have no right," he murmured, "to offer this, yet I cannot refrain." She accepted it delicately, unfolding the paper to reveal words penned with a careful hand, each sentence layered with reverence and longing. It spoke of recognition, of respect, and of a desire tempered by understanding. She felt the weight of every syllable settle over her, a promise of devotion intertwined with the careful acknowledgement of her dignity. Carefully maintained secret she had carried. The rain intensified, dripping from the brim of his hat and pooling along the edges of the steps, yet neither moved. They existed in a space suspended from time, where the world's judgment could not intrude, and where the fragile architecture of trust and recognition could flourish. She sensed that to step closer would be to surrender to both peril and possibility, yet the thought of retreat felt unbearable, as though denying the truth of their connection would unravel the very fabric of her being. Finally he knelt, not in submission to society, but in deference to her choice and her agency. The act was both intimate and public, a declaration crafted without ceremony, yet weighty with intent. "I ask not for compliance," he said, voice resonant against the backdrop of falling rain, "but for the honor of your hand, your trust, and your heart, if you will permit it." Her breath caught in her chest, the echo of candlelight and shadowed halls flashing through her memory. She realized that this moment, crafted in restraint and courage, contained the entirety of his regard, the culmination of weeks of careful observation and quiet longing. Tears pricked her eyes, unbidden and shimmering in the lamplight, yet she maintained her composure, hands pressed delicately together. I cannot promise the world," she whispered, voice breaking with both emotion and resolve. "But I can promise truth. I can promise presence. I can promise courage where it is needed most." His smile was slight, tempered, yet it held a depth that spoke of relief, understanding, and quiet triumph. He rose, lifting her hand to his lips with reverence, sealing the moment not with a kiss, but with the gravity of intention. Behind them, the manor remained silent, the glow of windows faint against the storm outside. The servants had retreated, the guests long since departed, and the house itself seemed to acknowledge the quiet victory of hearts united against expectation. She realized that the tokens, the whispers, and the subtle attentions had been but preludes to this reckoning, each act a thread in a tapestry now fully revealed. The Duke's patience, his careful defiance of convention, had led to a convergence of respect, longing, and courage that neither had dared name aloud until now. Yet even in triumph, uncertainty lingered. The storm outside was relentless, and the world beyond the manor's gates remained indifferent, governed by rigid hierarchy and whispered judgment. They were no longer merely two people. They were two people bound by choice, standing on the edge of society's scrutiny, aware that every gesture would be dissected, every word analyzed. She felt the tension of the world pressing against their fragile accord, yet it no longer frightened her as it once had. Courage had been tested, and in the quiet exchange of acknowledgement, it had endured. The Duke's voice broke the silence once more, low and steady. "There will be those who doubt, those who question, and those who seek to unravel what has been wrought here. But know this, my regard does not waver and neither must yours." She nodded, absorbing the certainty in his words, feeling a sense of resolve settle in her chest. The rain continued to fall, yet it no longer seemed to chill, it washed away remnants of hesitation, leaving only clarity and intention in its wake. As they stepped together into the manor, the warmth of the firelight embraced them, painting their silhouettes upon the polished floors and gilded walls. She felt the gravity of the house itself shift, acknowledging the union not of titles or station, but of choice and courage. Every shadowed corridor and gleaming mirror seemed to hold its breath, bearing witness to a resolution crafted in honesty, respect, and desire. The tokens, the terrace, the whispered confessions, they had all led to this moment, and its resonance would linger in memory long after the storm had passed. Outside, the city waited, blind to the transformation that had occurred within the walls. Yet she understood, in a way she had not before, that life's true measures were not in the judgment of strangers but in the deliberate acts of recognition, respect, and the willingness to choose one another despite peril. Hand in hand, she and the Duke moved through the halls, fully seen, fully present, and entirely committed to the fragile, exhilarating unknown that awaited beyond the gilded doors. And just as the storm began to abate, a faint knock sounded at the front gates. A messenger, a letter, an echo of the wider world pressing once more against the fragile sphere they had created. The rain had slowed, but the rhythm of fate, relentless and insistent, reminded them that every choice carried consequence, and every promise required vigilance. She looked to the Duke, and in the depths of his unwavering gaze, understood that this was not an end, but the threshold of a journey that neither could yet fully foresee. The days that followed were drenched in an uneasy calm, the kind that comes when hearts have been revealed but the world remains poised to punish any misstep. She moved through the house with careful deliberation, the knowledge of what had transpired between them both settling into her chest like a heavy, precious stone. The Duke's presence no longer hovered merely as possibility, it had become a constant, unspoken rhythm in her life. Yet, every glance from servants, every muffled remark from guests, reminded her that their bond existed not in the sanctioned corridors of society, but in a fragile realm of secrecy and quiet defiance. He appeared that morning without warning, striding through the great doors with the assurance of a man accustomed to dominion, yet softened by attention that bespoke private concern. She was arranging flowers in the drawing room, her fingers lingering on each petal with meticulous care, when she noticed the way he paused at the threshold, as if savoring the sight of her unobserved. There was no flourish, no dramatic announcement, merely a measured step that carried all the weight of intention. His eyes, dark and fathomless, swept over her as if cataloging not only her beauty, but the courage she had exhibited since their first encounter. "You have kept yourself remarkably composed," he said, voice low, a tremor barely perceptible beneath the strength of his tone. "Even under observation, even amidst those who would delight in your discomfort." She met his gaze, her heart fluttering, yet her posture remained dignified. "I have learned," she replied softly, "that the world observes regardless of one's consent. One must simply move with care or be broken by it." Her words, though measured, carried a subtle defiance that had taken years to cultivate, a quiet strength he had long admired from afar. The Duke moved closer, closing the distance with deliberate grace. "Care is admirable," he said, "but it is insufficient for what awaits you, and for what awaits us." His words hinted at the trials to come, the social scrutiny that would follow their revealed connection, yet also carried the undercurrent of a promise, that he would not falter in the face of opposition. She recognized the truth of it. In every action, in every look, he had chosen her, deliberately and unwaveringly, despite the risks that tethered them to the edges of propriety. It was then that the first challenge arrived. A letter, delivered by a hurried footman and sealed with the crest of a prominent London family, bore the unmistakable weight of societal judgment. The words contained thinly veiled threats, reminders of the Duke's responsibilities, and the expectation that propriety be maintained. She read the letter alone, the tremor in her hands betraying the calm she had worked to preserve. Each line struck at the fragile space they had begun to cultivate, a warning that society would not yield easily to the claims of affection or courage. When he learned of the correspondence, his expression darkened, the polished composure giving way to a controlled storm. "They see you as a distraction," he said quietly, pacing the length of the drawing room. "An inconvenience to be corrected, not a woman to be acknowledged. They will attempt to undo what we have built, to strip away your dignity and reduce you to spectacle." She watched him, noting the rare intensity in his gaze, the fire beneath the veneer of restraint. For the first time, she saw the full measure of his resolve, the willingness to confront forces far greater than either of them for the sake of her honor and their connection. Her own fear stirred, yet it was tempered by the recognition that she was not powerless. "Then we will meet it together," she said, voice steady, carrying the weight of conviction that had been nurtured over months of careful observation and quiet endurance. "We have survived observation, whispers, and expectation. Let them come, they will find us prepared." Her words struck a chord within him, a resonance of admiration mingled with affection. He nodded, and for a moment the world outside the manor's walls seemed to recede, leaving only the two of them and the fragile, luminous bond they had chosen to cultivate. Evening descended, carrying with it a tempest that mirrored the turmoil of the world beyond. Thunder rolled softly over London, and rain streaked the windows in silver rivulets. They met in the library, a space both intimate and insulated, where firelight danced across high shelves and gilded frames, painting their features with warmth and shadow. The Duke approached, his hand extending with the gentle authority of a man accustomed to command, yet tempered by reverence for the space between them. "You must know," he began, his voice hushed yet unyielding, "that what we face is no mere inconvenience. Society will test you, test us, with scrutiny and speculation that knows no mercy. And yet," his gaze softened, dark eyes searching hers, "and yet I cannot retreat from what I feel. I cannot allow the world's judgment to dictate my regard, nor its cruelty to determine your worth." She felt a surge of emotion, the mingling of relief, gratitude, and fear that had marked every step of their precarious journey. They spoke then in whispers, voices interlacing with the crackle of the hearth, of fears unvoiced, hopes guarded, and desires restrained. Each revelation, each carefully chosen confession, drew them closer, threading their lives together in a tapestry of trust and recognition. She allowed herself a fleeting hope, fragile yet luminous, that courage and affection might endure despite the weight of society and circumstance. Hours passed unnoticed. The storm outside raged with relentless intensity, yet within the library, a fragile calm prevailed. He traced a delicate arc along the back of her hand, a gesture at once intimate and formal, conveying respect, desire, and commitment without violating the boundaries of propriety. She responded not with words, but with the subtle press of her fingers against his, a declaration of mutual acknowledgement and quiet defiance. A sudden knock at the door shattered the delicate equilibrium. Both turned sharply, tension coiling in the air like a spring. A messenger entered, bearing news that threatened to upend the careful balance of their world. A rival family had begun to circulate rumors, aiming to compromise her reputation and, by extension, the Duke's standing. The weight of societal expectation crashed into them, tangible and unrelenting. Yet even as fear threatened, she met his gaze with unflinching resolve. "We will not yield," she said, her voice steady, carrying both authority and courage. "Let them speak. Let them judge. We have built what cannot be undone by whispers or malice." His expression softened, relief mingling with admiration. He reached for her hand once more, lifting it gently, sealing their silent agreement that whatever trials came, they would face them as one. The storm outside began to abate, leaving a damp, glimmering city behind the windows. They moved to the terrace, breathing in the freshness of rain-washed air, and allowed themselves a moment of respite. Lightning illuminated the skyline, brief and brilliant, and she realized that every fear, every hesitation, every token of attention that had preceded this night had been necessary preparation for the truth they now embraced. The bond between them was no longer tentative. It was deliberate, tested, and chosen, forged in both courage and restraint. As the first hints of dawn touched the horizon, the Duke spoke, voice soft yet resonant with certainty. "We have begun a journey few would dare, yet it is ours. Let the world contend with whispers and expectation. We contend only with truth and choice. And in truth I see you fully, without apology or restraint." She felt tears threaten but did not speak, letting the weight of the words settle, imprinting upon her a sense of triumph tempered by vigilance. The final act of the night came with quiet deliberation. He knelt again, not as a plea but as an affirmation of respect, of love, and of partnership. "I ask only that you stand with me," he said, voice unwavering, "that you allow what is ours to exist openly, without fear, without compromise. Will you walk forward with me?" She met his gaze, heart swelling, and felt the full measure of their journey. The humiliation, the whispers, the tokens, the stolen glances, culminate in a choice that was entirely hers. She placed her hand in his, solid and unwavering, the gesture both a promise and a challenge. "I will," she said, voice strong and clear. "And I will face the world, not as one hidden, not as one diminished, but as one seen and acknowledged." The Duke rose, lifting her hand to his lips with reverence, sealing their union not with ceremony, but with the deliberate weight of intention and devotion. As they stood together, hand in hand, the manor itself seemed to exhale, the weight of expectation yielding to the quiet triumph of courage and love. Beyond the windows, London awoke, indifferent yet illuminated by the certainty of their choice. And somewhere in the rhythm of the streets, in the echo of carriages and whispered conversations, the first tremors of recognition began to ripple, signaling that the world, no matter how rigid, could not contain what had been deliberately, irrevocably claimed. And in that moment, as dawn broke and the storm gave way to light, she understood fully that while trials would come, while judgment would hover like a distant storm cloud, nothing could undo the courage they had summoned, the choice they had made, or the truth that now bound them together, seen, acknowledged, and unbroken.